As we come out of that, President Cyril Ramaphosa addressing the UN General Assembly, let's get some reaction from Professor Dirk Kotze, who's following developments and joins us live now. Professor, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. We heard President Cyril Ramaphosa speaking quite in depth about South Africa's G20 presidency and what it seeks to achieve. He spoke a little bit, really expanding on how it ensures there's debt sustainability for low-income countries to support high and have low levels of debt maintenance and stability. And he also spoke about the importance of mobilizing finance for just energy transition without foregoing the base load energy source. I mean, what are your thoughts on some of the remarks that came out of the president's speech?
Yeah, I think what President Ramaphosa spoke about was very wide-ranging. Most of his speech was not about South Africa per se and South Africa's position, but rather speaking on behalf of Africa as a continent and the issues, and some of those that you have mentioned, including climate change and then the just transition, and then on top of that, all the developmental priorities that you referred to. Then at the same time, we went over to the issue about the threats, the security threats to the world, whether it is about nuclear matters or wars in different parts of Africa as well as other parts of the world, and then emphasizes the importance of adherence to international law. At the same time, then it addressed a number of matters that are very particular to South Africa's foreign policy. And that is the Palestinian situation, also in Cuba and Western Sahara. And then towards the end, he spoke more about the reform of the United Nations and specifically the Security Council. So it was looking at, one can almost say in this almost for a quarter of an hour, he summarized most of the main points of South Africa's foreign policy.
Yeah, and he made mention of how trade is now a threat being used against as a weapon against many countries in the world, speaking about how the embargoes must be lifted, the role of AGOA, and of course, I mean, that comes with great relevance considering what has happened and the ripple effect.
Yes, and definitely it refers to the South Africa's relationship with the US particularly. Yeah. But also in the case of AGOA, the US's relationship with Africa in general. At the same time, it refers to the African Continental Free Trade area or agreement and the potential that has. So I think, again, you mentioned some of the main issues about international trade and how it relates very much to South Africa, but also many other parts, and especially other African countries, as you refer to the problems about debt, which incidentally is very relevant for South Africa also. It's one of the main items on the South African national budget. And I think, therefore, it is something about how to reform all of this, especially international financial institutions.
As you speak about how the many countries are indebted and also making reference to South Africa's position, we know that he is really emphasizing and trying to bring that message to amplify African voices for economic growth. How much of an opportunity is there to use the platform to do so for the continent, and how effective that can actually be?
Well, the United Nations is the congregation of most of the nations of the world, so it is very easy from there to reach a very wide audience. But if we look at how the African continent is relating now to many of the world's biggest economic powers, it has increased or strengthened very significantly. And that, in that respect, one can talk about Japan very recently. The TICAD conference was there. The FOCAC event or meeting with China, the meetings with Russia, the summits, the American-African summits, the same with Turkey, the same with India. So these are all big economic powers nowadays that are actually almost competing for markets in Africa, and in order to have a preferential access to the African economies and the collective economy and market in Africa. So it's not as if the African and South African situation is dire, in a sense that we are in the same situation as 10, 15 years ago, when the emphasis was much more on dependence, on aid and support and humanitarian support that come to the African continent. Now it is much more about trade relations and about developing trade and markets for the different countries of Africa.
And perhaps let's touch on something back here at home. The Patriotic Alliance is threatening to collapse coalitions with the ANC. That's if Kenny Kunene is not reinstated. What does this reveal now about the fragility and transactional nature of coalition politics in South African metros?
Yes, unfortunately, it's again emphasizing the fact that the metros coalitions are less stable than, for example, the coalitions at provincial and national level. And especially the smaller parties are very often the cause of that. In the case of Johannesburg, the ANC has a very strong position, and together with Action SA, they can on their own almost form a coalition government. But the current arrangement is to be more inclusive, so the Patriotic Alliance with 8 seats out of the 270 is included in it. But they don't have a veto power on the continuation of a coalition or ANC-led coalition in Johannesburg. And I think in the end, given the fact that they are all approaching next year's local government election, they should be careful not to compromise themselves and become known or being seen as parties that actually are not cooperative, but rather maybe working in their own interest, and that can backfire at the time of elections. So we will have to see how the Patriotic Alliance are going to respond to this.
And that's a very important point, because Kunene was suspended over alleged links to Katiso Katie Molefe, then cleared his own party. Then the question is, how credible is a political party's internal clearance processes in cases where public trust and governance are at stake?
Yes, that is indeed so. And I think, given his own personal history, it's a very colorful history. And therefore, it is important that political parties like the Patriotic Alliance must think more than twice in their choices of people that they are going to put forward in next year's election. I think the South African electorate has become much more critical about the quality of candidates. And that especially next year, I think it's going to play definitely and grow. In the case of Kenny Kunene, he is the deputy leader of the Patriotic Alliance, so it's very difficult actually to keep him out of positions.
Very well.
But that is because that is the choice of the party. They possibly don't have many options. But in terms of what they are going to present to the electorate next year, I think all the parties, not only the Patriotic Alliance, will have to be very careful in what is the reputation of their candidates.
Yeah, very well. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Professor Dirk Kotze, a political analyst there, following developments and giving us an update of the President's address, as well as another matter here closer to home.